Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once more to our little webinar. Today, I have the great pleasure of welcoming none other than Rabbi Leo D. Welcome, Rabbi Leo D, and thank you very much for your time, first and foremost.
Thank you, Marco.
Now, I don't want to dwell too much on this, but of course, your name came in the headlines due to a tragic event, which obviously we will have to touch upon very briefly, and namely that was the murder of your wife and two daughters. Now, the many people have the idea that the 7th of October began on the 7th of October, when indeed many tragedies were taking place in the land of Israel, and especially in Judea, in Samaria, and Gush, Etzion. What can you elaborate a little bit more on that? Because many people won't be aware of the war of attrition that was taking place, the murders and the stabbings, and the violence and the incitement that had been taking place prior to the 7th of October.
Yes, Marco. I mean, not just in the few months before the 7th of October, but in fact, for the last 50 years, really, in this country, we've been under attack from different factions of enemies that surround us. And sadly, on the 7th of April, 6 months before the 7th of October, a year and a half ago, my wife and I were driving up in two separate cars. She had my daughters, Maya, who was 20, and Rena, who was 15. I had a couple of kids with me, and my fifth daughter was in Jerusalem for that Shabbat. We were driving very close to each other up from Jerusalem, basically up to the Sea of Galilee. And Lucy took a turning left. I continued straight to both acceptable routes on the 90 highway. And sadly, she encountered two Hamas terrorists with two Kalashnikovs and 20 bullets. And we buried my daughters on the Sunday and my wife on the Tuesday.
Indeed, indeed. Now, I think we should bear in mind that Hamas is only one side of the coin there. That we have what I define as the Palestinist Authority, because I don't give them the dignity of a national entity. Who, in the meantime, on their television, they continue to incite, and indeed, as I've mentioned in many previous webinars, qualitatively, it is no different to what we saw in Nazi Germany during the 30s.
Correct. And the Palestinian Authority continues to fund terrorism in Judea and Samaria, and therefore in Israel. And they have a list, which I don't know if it's still available on their website, of how much money they pay per Jew that's killed, or per month that the person is in prison. If the terrorist is killed, then the money goes to their families. We know that thousands of dollars a month go to these families, each of these families, for murdering Jews. And then they also train the children from very early age, from literally the age of about 6 or 7. We have plenty of video evidence of summer camps where these kids are trained to kill Israelis, kill Jews, in UNRWA schools. So UNRWA, which I think today has been banned from Israel, is a terror organization that cooperates with Hamas and obviously with the Palestinian Authority to train terrorists. I actually have a copy of a Palestinian textbook for Arabic language for fifth grade kids. And there's a whole page dedicated to a particular Arab terrorist who murdered 20 or 30 Israelis in the 1970s, and a comprehension exercise about how she did it and what they would have done in a similar situation. And this book, by the way, was printed in 2023. Mm-hmm. So until today, UNRWA funded textbooks. UNRWA schools are training Palestinian kids to kill Jews. and the Palestinian Authority, funded by the EU and Britain and America and other countries, is paying terrorists to do so. It's the only terrorist incentive scheme, I think, that exists in the world.
Indeed, and indeed. And I think we should bring to the attention of all our viewers and all our listeners that it's their taxpayers' money which indirectly has been financing a policy which is known as pay for slay. Okay, so for those of you who are listening out there, you should be pressuring your MPs, your government representatives, wherever they are, and bring it to their attention. It has, of course, been brought to their attention many a time, because I know Itamar Marcus of Palestinian Media Watch regularly lectures to European MPs. But of course, the tin ear is activated very often. Indeed, it's very often the case that people don't want to listen to this, or they simply ignore it. Indeed. Now, we of course speak about the I define them as the Palestinist Authority, because I don't want to use their narrative, which is a phony narrative. And very often I say that not only have Jews been the victims of this terrorist regime, but indeed very often well-meaning people of the regime they purport to represent. I was just reading an old article in the Jerusalem Post, in which you gave an interview to the Jerusalem Post, in which you described the good relations that obtained with many of the local Arabs in the Gush Etzion. Can you elaborate a little bit on that for us?
Yes. See, there was a policy that's been undertaken in the last 10, 20 years by the Israeli government to encourage or to allow Palestinians in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, to work in Israel and also in settlements. This meant that about 200,000 Palestinians were coming in every day into Israel or into our settlements and working. And the great workers, the great builders, they're a lot of them very lovely people. And I personally got to know a number of Palestinians who I'm still in touch with. When this happened, I received messages from my Palestinian friends, which were as emotional, even more emotional than some of my Jewish friends. I think they felt doubly upset about what had happened. First, the personal tragedy, and secondly, the fact that they partly felt guilty that it was one of their brothers or cousins who did this. And the expression was going around the Arab population around us was, these are not human beings. This is not the will of Allah.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And what's interesting is that we actually made some magnets, which most of my neighbors have, with one of the sayings that Lucy used to have. She used to, on a Friday night dinner, ask 3 questions to the family. Number 1, what did you do for someone this week? Number 2, what did someone do for you this week? And number 3, what did God do for you this week? And we still go around the table and ask these questions. And this was printed on car magnets. And my Palestinian garage mechanic saw it and said, can I translate it into Arabic? Because he has a number of his customers from Bethlehem who would like to have it on their cars. So we did it. And he sent me photographs of Palestinian number plate cars, white number plates, going around with these magnets, which is quite amazing, because it had an Israeli flag in the background as well. So the fact that it's Palestinians driving around Bethlehem with Israeli flags is really quite astonishing. Right. But I think it shows the extent to which some of the good Palestinians felt our tragedy.
Indeed, and I, as a tour guide, I can echo that sentiment, because I very often have very good relationships with the local Arab population, be they Christian or Muslim. I can confirm that there are well-meaning people and that they are victims of this Palestinist regime, whereby they are brainwashed and incited, and we see the results. Their children are basically the victims of child abuse by this regime, which which basically does the work that the Nazis did 80 years ago. It's perhaps even a little bit worse. Now, what I wanted to touch upon, last week we had a lady who also is involved in a type, let's say, type of outreach and trying to involve Arab children and Jewish children in activities, obviously children from under the Palestinist Authority. Very well-meaning person, Hashomer Hatzair person who lives in a kibbutz in the north of the country. Obviously, what happened on the 7th of October has modified people's perspectives. I think on the one hand, there was a great amount of wishful thinking with regard to what could be done with an entity that wants the physical destruction of the Jews in the land of Israel. What's your impression? Has something changed? Because certainly I always saw, excuse me, I always saw Oslo as a recipe for disaster.
So it's very interesting, Marco. I was talking about the 200,000 Arabs who were coming every day into Israel to work before the 7th of October from Judea and Samaria. That accounted for about 80% of the economy in those towns in the Judea and Samaria, because they're earning well over twice what any of their compatriots were earning within their own territories, and each of them was supporting a family of on average probably 7 people. So you can do the maths. And that meant that there was a tremendous incentive for these Arabs to get on with us, and they were building up a reasonable economy for themselves. In Gaza, that was not the case. In Gaza, there were 15,000 Arabs every day coming in, and the population of Arabs is similar in both the regions. So it was only accounting for literally 10% of their economy, and there was no incentive for them not to attack us. And I think what we see here is that the approach of a carrot and a stick is what we need in this region. So we had a carrot in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria. We didn't have a carrot in Gaza. And there is no stick, interestingly, in either place, meaning that the Israeli government, up until the 7th of October, turned a blind eye to the building of tunnels, the accumulation of weapons, the training of kids, the paying of terrorists that we've talked about. But actually, if we could change the policy, and this is what's being discussed at the moment, which is fascinating, if we can change the policy towards the Palestinist authorities, you call it, and to the new authorities that will have to be set up in Gaza to create a carrot and a stick, then we could actually have a sustainable peace. What would that look like? It would look like probably setting up individual town councils for Bethlehem, Jericho, Ramallah, and then the equivalent sort of 200,000 people sized towns in Gaza. Each would have their own leadership. If any particular region was terror-free for a certain period of time, they would then get the ability to work in Israel, earn a very good living, and have a good life. And if they chose to continue with terror, then they could be sealed off by the IDF and left to fight each other until they eventually learn that actually peace is a much healthier solution. So that's a carrot and stick approach, which is they can have work permits, they can work and earn lots of money, they can be friendly with us, and we're delighted to have them, or they can choose the other option, in which case they really will not have any good life.
I think clearly that would require a policy similar to that which the Allies applied in Nazi Germany, namely the de-Palestinization of the population. They have developed this phony consciousness, and they have built it up over the years, also with the complicity of many Israelis, the truth be told. Many people on a certain side of the political spectrum, and also some people on the right, from out of pure ignorance, have let them get away with this phony narrative, which is self-oppressing. to be perfectly honest. They've created a false identity, a destructive identity, because at the end of the day, it is self-destructive. It's fermented and fueled by the sheer hatred. The only raison d'etre that this so-called nationality has is the destruction of the Jews. That is why Palestinism came about. It had no other function. It didn't give expression to a particular nationality or religion that was grounded in a long-standing history. And in fact, what they do with a sleight of hand, may I say, is they claim to be descendants of ancient Canaanites, Philistines, Girgashites, Hittites. So it would require some pretty, let's say, pretty rigorous and pretty thorough moves by the Israeli government, removing the PA and de-Palestinizing the population, which would take years.
Yeah, surprisingly though, it doesn't have to. It doesn't necessarily take as long as you think. I think that it's interesting that in the Bible, we learn that Israel is obviously a Jewish homeland, but there is room for non-Jewish people to live in Israel. But there's two criteria that they have to meet. Number one, they have to support it as being a Jewish country. Number two, they have to keep the 7 Noahide laws, which include not killing and setting up courts of law, which means that they would have to take their own killers to justice. And obviously those are things which they're not currently doing. So I actually heard the finance minister, Smotrich, speaking at a conference a few days ago. And he was saying that this is effectively what we need to implement in Israel, that the Arabs who want to accept us as a Jewish state and are prepared not to kill us and to prosecute those of their people who do attempt to kill us, are welcome to stay and even become citizens. But those who are not prepared to accept us as a state or continue to try and kill us, cannot continue to live in these territories. They can choose any of the surrounding Arab states to move to, or European states that will welcome them in because they clearly have so many supporters in universities around Europe and America. And they're welcome to move to those places if they don't believe in our right to exist. And that is the solution for this current round.
I think we should ask our viewers whether they would be amenable to that proposition, Rabbi D. I'm not sure they would. I think the chickens are coming home to roost. I think people are beginning to realize what Islamism is. I'm not talking about Islam. There's a decent expression of Islam. We all know that, but certainly Islamism is something that doesn't leave much space for other faiths or other views.
What is positive, though, in our region is that these battles with Hamas and Hezbollah, which thank God seem to be going extremely well, except for this sad loss of Jewish soldiers' lives. But the battles are going extremely well. Hamas is being completely neutered, I think it's fair to say, because we've now cut off the border with Egypt. They can't get any more weapons. The latest news on Hezbollah is that the Israeli army has destroyed 80% of their missiles. And of course, the whole top management team, there was a joke going around after the pages that the new level of management in Hezbollah were not senior enough, a month ago to merit having their own pager. And that's who's running the organization at the moment. And of course, with Iran, Israel wiped out their air defenses last week, and they're preparing the grounds for a large attack on their nuclear facility. So once we destroy their nuclear facility and their ability to send nuclear bombs over to us and to you in Italy, I think the whole of the Middle East will be a much safer place. The Saudis are thanking us, the Jordanians are thanking us, the United Arab Emirates are thanking us. And this conference was interesting. It was about the Abraham Accords. There's 8 Muslim countries lining up to join the Abraham Accords as soon as this war is over. I've heard, I think it was public in the news a few months ago, Indonesia is one of them. Indonesia being the largest Muslim country in the world.
Indeed,
with a population of like 500 million people. So, so the potential for sustainable peace, has never been so great. And this is really because we are winning a war against the axis of evil. and substantially. And we're showing that Iran is a paper tiger, full of threats, but actually with very little ability to attack, very much like Russia. And the more that these totalitarian regimes are exposed for the the fakes that they are, the better for all of us, not just in Israel, of course, in Europe and in America, for the whole Western world. So Israel is fighting now a war for our benefit and, of course, for your benefit in Italy.
Indeed, the operative concept here, so our viewers should understand, is that the world needs a strong Israel, and Israel needs to show the way and needs to avoid certain blunders like believing in phony solutions, land for peace, because that's tantamount to giving a refund to wars of aggression. And I'm of the opinion that even the Camp David agreements 40 years ago were a big mistake. They set a very dangerous precedent, which was followed by the Oslo Accords. Let me see if Renzo wants to ask some questions. He's my assistant this evening. Let me see if he has any questions he'd like to answer, and then I'll come back to you.
Thank you very much for your testimony about what happened to you. And hearing what you said before, I'm asking myself if all of these violence that we see, and of course since the 7th of October of last year, we see that this violence came to surface, and also the media started talking about it. But your testimony says that this kind of violence is indeed something that is rooted inside the population that is surrounding Israel. Don't you think that the violence that has been silenced for many years is a way to support the cause against Israel? Because I meet many people also because I'm a student of university, and they don't know much about what is happening really, but they are listening to what they told them, and of course is against Israel. So I don't know. I feel that this kind of silencing of what the Arab people made for decades against Israel is a way to support the cause against Israel. What do you think about it?
No, Renzo, I think you're right, and but I look at it differently. The huge support for free Palestine that we've seen across the world, starting on the 7th of October. When I speak to Jewish crowds in America, often Britain, I tell them it's a blessing. Why is it a blessing? Because not one anti-Semite was created on the 7th of October. Every anti-Semite who is standing in the street today, walking down the streets of Milan, Rome, or New York or Paris, shouting, "Kill the Jews" and another intifada, was an anti-Semite actually on the 6th of October as well, but we couldn't see them. Something happened on the 7th of October which created a greater visibility of evil in the world. And this is a blessing because it's great for the Jewish people to see what they're up against, particularly in America, where they believe that everyone loves them, and clearly that's not the case for everyone. It's good for non-Jewish people to see what Jewish people are suffering today, 80 years after the Holocaust, all over the world. So I think that this indeed is a blessing. And by the way, this new revelation of evil is accompanied by a revelation of good. We've seen tremendous miracles happening, and I'm sure you've seen them too. We saw a president and a foreign minister of Iran drop out of the sky in a miraculous situation where one helicopter fell out of the sky out of three and happened to contain those two people. We saw probably 500 ballistic missiles fired from Iran in 2 attacks. And not one person was injured, I think, except one Arab person in Jericho. That is a miracle. We saw at the beginning of this whole event, a Turkish member of parliament, if you haven't seen this, look it up on YouTube. Turkish member of parliament stood up in the Turkish parliament, cursed Israel for 2 minutes and dropped dead on the spot in the parliament. And which again is not normal. I mean, we're seeing miracles every day. There are stories about soldiers, miracles happening to soldiers. I'll tell you one of them, which you may have already heard. It was also quite a few months ago. An Israeli tank stopped in Gaza, and they got out to have their lunch. And in Israel, it's common to take the tuna tins with oil and put a tissue paper into it and set fire to it in order to smoke it for 10 minutes and then to eat it. So one of the young soldiers did this, and his friend said to him, "You're mad." He said, "We've got live ammunition here. You can't have a live fire." So he immediately picked it up and he threw it into the bush. The moment it hit the bush, it exploded, and they ducked down, and 4 Hamas terrorists came out with white flags. They were hiding in the entrance of a tunnel there, ready to pounce. And so there are many stories like this happening all over Israel at the moment. Not to mention the pages, which in the exploding pages, which itself was a miracle, and the assassination of Nasrallah and Sinwar and so forth. So I think that we're at a time of huge revelation. What's interesting, by Jewish tradition, I think probably by Christian tradition, at the time of the Messiah, then it's said that there will be a time of greater revelation, meaning greater visibility of good and evil. And we're certainly coming to this particular point. And actually, by Jewish law, the definition of the Messianic era is actually a time when Israel is no longer at existential threat from her enemies. That is the definition of the Messianic era, according to our Talmud. This war is the war to get rid of the existential threat from our enemies. So effectively, by definition, this is the war for the Messiah. And it's fascinating. Now, often people ask, why should it be now? And what's interesting is there's another strange Jewish law, which is that when the majority of Jews live in Israel, then it's a sort of tipping point for Jewish history. Well, it's fascinating because the last census of Jews came out just about 2-3 weeks ago and said that there are 7.6 Jews now living in Israel. We know there are around 14 to 16 million Jews in the world, maybe 15 million. We've just passed the tipping point. But this is the first time since the kingdom of David 3,000 years ago, when the majority of Jews have lived in Israel. Because after that, Jews moved to Babylon and to other places. They didn't come back often. So during the Second Temple period, the minority of Jews were living in Israel. And since then, certainly a minority have been living in Israel. Most Jews have been living outside of Israel. This is the time in history where Jews are coming back. We're back to King David, messianic times. And this is substantial for us, is substantial, I think, for you. And we really are seeing miracles every day.
Yeah. I think that's great. That's a great news. And I think that this must be something that keep us the faith of seeing peace in Jerusalem, of course, as the Bible says, but also in all the land of Israel, because of course we see that now that many people that is against Israel is shouting and is taking courage, seeing crowds that are moving against Israel. But I think that the thing that you share with us is something that will keep our faith and believing in a future peace. So thank you very much.
So look, it's interesting. By Jewish tradition, when good is prevailing, then evil starts rising up to try and prevent it. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. And actually, the presence of evil is actually the greatest proof of the presence of good. One other thing I'd like to say as well is that there's a difference. We talk about peace, and I'm very much a stickler, like Marco doesn't like talking about Palestinians. I don't like the word peace. I'll tell you why. Because peace comes from the Latin pax. You probably know better than I do, but that means absence of fighting. Whereas shalom comes from the Hebrew word meaning complete. In other words, shalom is talking about a solution, whereas peace is talking about a ceasefire. And the way I liken this is to two children fighting in a playground, and one teacher takes one and one teacher takes the other and pulls them apart. So you have peace, but until the third teacher comes along and finds out what they were fighting about and resolves it, we don't have shalom. So this is a war for shalom. We don't want peace anymore. We've had peace agreements, we've had ceasefires. They haven't worked. They're very temporary. This is an opportunity, and I've heard many Israeli politicians say this now, for a new Middle East. This is an opportunity for the correct structure in the Middle East, for shalom, and it's worth fighting for, because this is really going to protect our children and grandchildren and future generations and yours, and prevent this terrorism virus spreading beyond where it is now in Europe and in Israel to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I think that sorry, Marco, just
go ahead.
Just one thing. I think that what you said is very important, because the difference between peace and shalom, because I think that many politicians now is talking about peace in the Middle East, and they try to make peace, building up a solution as the two-state solution. But I think that as you explained, there is the great difference. In my opinion, then I want to hear your opinion. But in my opinion, this false peace that is aimed by the two-state solution will never give shalom to the Middle East. But what do you think about it?
That's correct. I mean, the issue is that our definition of a state for the Palestinians is different to their definition. Israelis would be happy for them to have a state, the Palestinians to have a state, if they didn't have any weapons, they didn't have an army, they wouldn't have an air force, their borders would be under our control, and thereby we would be happy with that situation for a state. They don't recognize that as a state, and therefore there is no two-state solution. But actually, the solution that I was talking about earlier, which is now being discussed, which is that each town or city, Palestinian city, has its own sort of self-control, but no military capability whatsoever, is a solution. And in fact, there is a possibility even turning those cities into city-states, very much like Monaco, Andorra, San Marino, even the Vatican, which are all very small states with 200,000 or far less than that people with their own passport. The benefit of that would be that this would not be defined as apartheid under international law. Each Palestinian, Bethlehem Arab would have a Bethlehem passport. If they were peaceful with us, have no weapons, they will come in and work in Israel. They travel around Israel, fly out to Ben Gurion Airport, and they can live like someone from Monaco would live in France, or someone from the Vatican would live in Rome, and so forth. So this would be fine. They wouldn't have a vote in our government. They'd have a vote for their government, and we could live in peace. So actually a multi-state solution is actually, in my opinion, a very practical solution here, where each of the states is completely surrounded by Israel. We would annex the whole Judea and Samaria and allow them to have their cities as city-states. And that is a very practical solution that could be implemented very rapidly.
If I want to, I just wanted to pick you up on that. Actually, a few years ago, when there was talk about extending Israeli sovereignty to the Jordan Valley, most of the Arabs who live there very much welcomed coming under Israeli sovereignty. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure
that's for sure. There's no question. If we were to offer every Palestinian Israeli citizenship tomorrow, they would all accept it, but it wouldn't necessarily be good for Israel, because we'd end up with another 4 million Arab citizens, which would then flood us out in terms of votes in the Knesset. So the solution to that, in my opinion, is only one solution: is that they have votes in their governments, which are separate, independent states not connected. You get rid of the Palestinist authority, as you call it, which has no purpose whatsoever today, except for terror and corruption. And once you remove that and allow individual Palestinians and individual cities to rise up and manage themselves, then actually you create a much more democratic, fairer society.
I get your point. No, I was just giving the example of how what their affiliation, what their sentiment is for the Palestinist Authority. Not that I thought it was a solution, conceding citizenship to the denizens of the Jordan Valley. It was I think we also really need to stress what our friends and viewers can do as well to further this, because we have to get this narrative across. We have to dispel this phony Palestinist narrative. And I think I want to link onto what you were just saying before, that you simply can't just make peace by pronouncing peace and creating the right atmospherics, as some people want. Very much the Oslo concept was creating the nice atmospherics and everybody would live happily ever after. And I think what we have to introduce some concepts that are really fundamental to peace, and that is truth and justice leads to peace. We really have to get this across, and by certainly falsifying the narratives, that is a negation of both truth and peace. What are your views on that?
Yes, I mean, you're talking, Mark, about what our friends in Italy can do. Let me tell you something which I've done in America. After the 7th of October, I traveled quite a few times, spoke to 15, maybe 20 campuses of American universities, thousands of mostly Jewish students. And what came out of that was that what really needs to be done is not to counter-protest against the Free Palestine with an Israeli flag, which is what they were doing, but to turn up to the protest with an American flag. And what's interesting is when people have turned up with American flags, often they've been burnt by the other side.
Indeed.
And this has created a huge amount of publicity for the cause of the West against the Palestinians, because I think one of the confusing issues for good American citizens, Italian citizens, who don't support terrorism, is they don't really understand what's going on here. And the moment you turn up and you make it an Israeli-Palestinian issue on the streets of Milan, I think 90% of Italians turn off and not interested in what's going on. They don't think it's relevant. But if you turn up to these Free Palestine marches and counter-protests with Italian flags and European flags, and maybe hand them over to the protesters, see what they want to do with them, and catch that on film, then I think that the message, which is the true message, which is that these people actually hate Italy and they actually want to destroy the West, comes out, and people can see them for what they are. And I think that's a much more powerful a message. So it is about truth and cutting through the lies of these protesters.
Yes, you anticipated just what I wanted to say, because Palestinism, I've maintained this for many a year, it's the retrovirus which weakens the European immune system, thereby allowing all those forces that hate the idea of a Western liberal democracy. They infiltrated and weakened the immune system. That's I've always maintained that. And in fact, we see that happening now, in the sense that all the worst forces, those that hate the West, are coalescing around Palestinism. If you notice, every protest in the world, whether it's the anarchists, the Antifa, and so on and so forth, they all coalesce around Palestinism. Palestinism invigorates them.
And you know what, Marco, it's actually a good thing. And what's happened, as we've seen in country after country, I think including Italy, except for Britain, interestingly, more right-wing governments have come in to fight against this this extreme liberalism, And we'll see what happens
They're
next
not
week.
that the problem is they're not that liberal. They abuse the old classical liberalism.
It's
Liberalism.
the new
Yeah.
liberalism, which stands for destroying the West. Yeah,
Yeah.
whatever you call that. And we'll see what happens next week in the American elections. What's interesting is that 2024 was the year of the most number of elections in the world, in the world history.
Interesting.
So this all exploded, and you know, I think this is something that's come from, you know, God. There's not coincidence that this
Indeed.
exploded at a time when people around the world have to vote for new leaders, and the fakeness and the evil of some of these regimes around the world that support this evil in the Middle East has come to everyone's attention just at the time when people are choosing their governments. And I think it's certainly a very important factor of people making decisions who they're selecting. So this Israel is changing world politics, just by being here, which is really quite incredible.
That's right. October the 7th was a watershed moment in many ways. It was an earthquake within Israeli society and also abroad among Jews around the world. Let's look at. I'd like to touch on these two things. Let's look at within the Jewish world in Israel first and foremost. What is your analysis of the situation in Israel now?
So after our tragedy, I was asked by a number of Israelis to try and promote unity, Jewish unity in Israel, because at the time, if you remember, left-wing and right-wing Israelis were marching against each other, both holding Israeli flags, interestingly enough, but they were marching against each other, for Bibi, against Bibi, and the feeling was that the country was being torn apart by these protests. And I said at the time, I don't think we have a problem with unity, because they're marching with their flags and we're marching with our flags. They're marching for a better tomorrow for their children, for the country, and we're marching for a better tomorrow for our children, for the country. We don't agree on how to do that. There was argument about the Supreme Court and how the judges were going to be selected. We didn't agree on how that was going to be done. We didn't have uniformity, but we did have unity. And what was interesting was that on the 7th of October, when this terrible tragedy happened, we saw that unity emerge immediately, which means it was there all the time.
It recompacted.
It was there all the time. It was just that suddenly we didn't just have unity, we actually had uniformity. Everybody realized we have one enemy, and it's not each other. It's the enemy from outside. And what was really incredible was how every Israeli and many Jews around the world, and even non-Jews and Christians around the world, suddenly jumped into action. And people just started helping in any way they could. And the government failed us, the army failed us on the 7th of October, but the people picked up the slack. And civilians were packing soldiers off with food and providing food to the soldiers on the front line because they didn't have any food. People were packing clothes to soldiers, and Jews around the world were raising money in order to buy them new equipment because their helmets were out of date and their bulletproof vests were out of date. Hundreds of millions of dollars were raised within a few days. Equipment was being sent all around the world, and this was all being run by civilians, not by the army. The army was in complete turmoil. The government was in turmoil, but the soldiers actually got. I mean, there are incredible stories of soldiers who, civilians really, who picked up on the 7th of October. They heard that there was what was going on from friends who were calling them from the south, and they realized they were under attack. They understood that for whatever reason the army hadn't got there. They jumped in their cars, took their pistols, and they just turned up in Be'eri and Kfar Aza and started shooting terrorists. And there was a beautiful story of two religious guys who came from Otniel, two brothers, and they went down to Be'eri and killed a number of terrorists. And they then went house to house getting the families to be able to leave and get out of Be'eri. Now, the people of Be'eri are very anti-religious in general. And there was a testimony from one woman who said that, she had objected to the building of a synagogue in Be'eri about 2 or 3 years earlier. And she was so anti-religious, she felt that, any religious influence on her children would change them in some terrible way. And when these 2 religious boys turned up and spoke to them in Hebrew and convinced them that they were actually Jewish soldiers and not Arabs in disguise, she said she suddenly realized she'd been wrong for her whole life. And that actually, this artificial barrier that she put up against the religious people, against religion, was completely unfounded, and it was like a complete aha moment for her. Sadly, one of those brothers was killed very soon after that.
Certainly many people had an epiphany on that fateful day. The Jews abroad, I wanted now to talk about Jewry around the world, because obviously to a certain extent, and I think you will agree, for Jews around the world, it is a make your mind up time moment. What are your thoughts on that?
It's interesting. I travel a lot abroad to speak to Jewish audiences about making Aliyah, about immigrating to Israel. And I always say to them, I'm an odd person to be recommending this after what happened to my family. But let me tell you something. I said that, since 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, about 35,000 Jews have been killed in the world, have been lost to the world because they're Jewish, mostly Israeli soldiers and victims of terror, but a few people outside in Buenos Aires and other places where there have been terror attacks, but generally mostly in Israel. And that equates to about 1 per day for 76 years. About 1 Jew per day has been lost for 76 years. I said, let's see what happened before that. I said, well, if you look at from the time of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD until 1948, the establishment of the State of Israel, well, in 70 AD, there were 5 million Jews in the world. If that number had grown proportionately with the Chinese population at the time, today, in 1948, there would have been 200 million Jews in the world, and there weren't. There were 12 million. So 188 million Jews were lost over about 1900 years. That equates to 200 per day for 1,900 years. So the loss of Jews to the world went down from 200 per day to 1 per day on the establishment of the State of Israel. And I look at the Jews in the room when I'm speaking to them, and I say, if you make Aliyah, and if all the Jews from outside of Israel make Aliyah and come back home, I said, then that number will go down to 0, because that is the clear trend. Went down from 200 to 1, and if you come home, it will go down to 0. And that is what we're seeing. We're seeing a tremendous return. We're expecting a massive influx of Jews over the next few years, because after every major war in Israel, we've seen a massive Aliyah. And this war is exceptional because not only has there been a great war and a big victory that we're about to have, but also it's been accompanied by tremendous anti-Semitism particularly in America, where most Jews outside of Israel live. And so many Jews are starting to think about Aliyah who never even considered it before. So we're seeing a tremendous turnaround in the Jewish world. I mean, and remember that in 1948 there were 600,000 Jews in Israel, and 11 million outside, 11.5 million outside. And today we have the majority of Jews in Israel. So the Jewish world is completely transformed.
Indeed, very true, very true. We both stress the importance of Aliyah. Aliyah has to be the great project of the next few decades, I think, within the Jewish world. Turning slightly away, averting our gaze towards the non-Jewish population, because people very often bandy the word apartheid state, this, that, and the other, through ignorance or bad faith. Okay, I think we see these two things coming together. Okay, tell us a little bit. I mean, my experiences, generally speaking, with the minorities is that we have very integrated minorities, especially among the Druze and Christian populations, and increasingly among the Muslim population too. What's your impression?
Yes, as we know, there are famous Arab justice, judges in the Supreme Court, footballers, businessmen, and women, and actually, I studied in Hebrew University, a master's degree a few years ago. The majority of my course were Arab Israelis studying in the medical, and in fact, if you go to hospital in Israel, most of the nurses, many of the doctors are Arabs, Christians, Muslims. There is, people work side by side, often have very close friendships with each other. This is, no more apartheid than Italy or Britain or France.
Certainly not. No, and I think the notion of a Jewish state, in fact, increases the security and the capacity of those minorities to fulfill their spiritual, economic, and intellectual aspirations. I think they have abundant opportunity to weave themselves into the fabric of Jewish society, which creates great opportunity for the minorities. I think it's a mutually beneficial relationship, when, of course, they do understand, of course, the benefits of a Jewish state. I think it's a guarantee rather than a hindrance.
And what's fascinating, actually, at the moment, particularly in this Lebanon war, is seeing on social media the response of Lebanese people and Syrians who cheered the death of Nasrallah and are begging us and the IDF to complete the war, the destruction of Hezbollah, which has destroyed their country. And then, of course, these are Lebanese Christians, who are about 30%, 40% of the population, and have seen their country destroyed from a really wealthy Western country, 50 years ago to what it is today.
That was very much national suicide. I think people should be reminded that, unfortunately, the PLO were allowed into Lebanon, thereby destroying the social fabric of the social and political fabric and stability of the country.
And we see the same with Iranians, which is fascinating. We saw Bibi stand up on TV 2-3 weeks ago saying that we love the Iranian people. We have nothing against you. We only have a problem with your regime. And we look forward to you taking control back of your country. And you see Persian, Iranians from all over the world, and even from Iran, publishing videos about how they support the IDF and please finish the job. And this is really quite incredible. So not only are we getting tremendous support from the Saudis and UAE and the Jordanians and so forth for what we're doing, but we're also getting support from our enemies, civilians in these countries, who are urging us to finish off their regime. So I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like this, but I think it gives a lot of strength to the Israeli position, which is we're fighting for justice, for democracy, for freedom. And to the extent that people can be liberated from these evil terror regimes that exist around us, it's good for them, it's good for us, and it's good for you.
Indeed, indeed. Just before we finish, I'm getting a few questions on the chat here. There's a lady who'd like to, Dr. Fogarola would like to know, do you as a religious person experience the current, in the light of this present situation, are there any references in the Torah which resonate with the present situation? You mentioned some. Are there any other situations which you'd like to highlight?
There are many references in the Torah which are often used to show what is happening in Israel is really messianic. In fact, the Talmud actually tells us a lot about the time before the Messiah. Bear in mind, it was written 1,500 years ago. Tells us that Jews will be evacuated from the northern and southern borders. That prices will go up, which is talking about high inflation, that there'll be a panic and people will say, no one's who's there to save us? There's no government, there's no army, and then people will put their faith in God. But actually, no, there are references in the Torah. There are two sections of the Torah. I can't give you their chapters and verses, but we call them bechukotai and kitavo. So there's a section in Leviticus, another section in Deuteronomy, which talk about if the Jewish people don't follow the law, they'll be punished. The first punishment that's listed out in the book of Leviticus is quite short. It's followed by a positive message at the end of it. The second one in Deuteronomy is a very, very long punishment that's meted out and doesn't end on a good note. And the rabbis explained this and say that the first one's referring to the first exile, which was the 70 years between the destruction of the second temple and the building of the first. But the second one in Deuteronomy is referring to the 2,000-year exile that we've just been through. And what's interesting is that a couple of chapters later, it says that when you finally repent and come back to the land, then God will bring you all these blessings. So it actually says that the solution, or rather the command at the end of that 2,000-year exile will be to repent, in other words, to become more religious, and also to come back. Why do we need two separate commands, at the end? And it's interesting to know that half the Jews in the world live outside of Israel. They have to come back. And the ones who live in Israel have to repent. And presumably the ones who come back will have to repent when they come back as well. So the Torah is really talking about the specific time in history. It's quite clear. And as I say, we really are in biblical times where the majority of the Jewish people are now back in our homeland. We have a concept in halacha, in Jewish law, that the majority is like everything, which basically means there's a tipping point. So when the majority come back to Israel, it's as if the whole Jewish people are now in Israel, and that's the significance of where we are today. I think we will see more and more miracles, and please God, we should all merit to see the Messiah speedily in our days. And Amen.
Indeed. Amen, amen, amen. I think that's a wonderful way to end our little webinar today, Rabbi D. Thank you so much for your gracious presence.
Thank you.
It was wonderful having you here. And perhaps we can repeat it again someday, of course, when you have time and nothing better to do.
Okay. Thank you. And
okay.
Have a good week.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Sei gesund.